One of the modern symbols of America can rightfully be considered the huge stinking truck. As a rule, the only thing traveling in its bed is the driver's ego and nothing else. Every year, both the size of the truck and the loans taken out for them grow. Americans complain that they can no longer pay them off, but how can one refuse the temptation to floor this 3 tons of debt slavery on some overpass? Fortunately, there are plenty of overpasses, highways, freeways, avenues, boulevards, and just plain streets in America. About 90% of adult population here has a driver's license, and by managing to elect Trump for a second time, America has only further preserved itself in this state. I'm not going to spend the whole video cosplaying Not Just Bike YouTube channel with classic stories about the harm of cars. All jokes aside, there are a lot of cool and pleasant stuff in American lifestyle, but to create the ideal country for cars, unique circumstances and unique people were required. And today's story is about the most prominent of them. For 44 years, he possessed colossal power, but was never elected in an election. He built 13 bridges, 45 highways, and set the contours of modernization for the entire east coast of the United States. Yet, he did not know how to drive a car. The name of this man is Robert Moses, and more than most, he cemented in the minds of Americans the archetype of the millionaire villain, currently represented by Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Donald Trump. Or maybe it's all leftist nonsense. Let's figure it out. We are currently near Triborough Bridge, and it's a unique structure. It's not one bridge, but a complex of 3 bridges that stitch together 3 boroughs of New York, and that's where it gets its name. Only one of its parts once was the world's largest vertical lift bridge. The central span, weighing thousands of tons, rises 80 feet, which is about 24 meters, upward for the passage of ships. It was this bridge that became the main project and later the source of power for Robert Moses. Continuing the topic of villains, he even had a super-villain headquarters right under this bridge. But let's take everything in order. This is a story about a strong hand that knows how to manage stuff better than the others. As is fitting for those who achieved everything themselves, Moses was born into a wealthy family and received an elite education. At the same time, he managed to study at Yale, Oxford, and Columbia University all at once, and, as is fitting for villains, he had a vision for a better world. Which, all jokes aside, not all devoid of meaning. The young Moses believed in pure meritocracy. He believed that candidate for a particular position in the government should be selected only based on the abilities and merits of the candidates, not guided by political benefits or personal preferences. Even the strongest politician would only be able to push something like this through with great luck, and for young Moses it became a total failure. From his early political endeavors, he derived a disappointment in democratic institutions and skill of inserting hidden loopholes into legal documents, which in the future allowed him to bypass that very democratic control. But it is worth clarifying here that the management of New York itself back then was corrupt at the level of system itself. To everyone who believes that everything was much better before and that democracy is just a screen for real global puppeteers, I recommend googling Tammany Hall. So in the place of the young idealist Moses, most of us would probably have been disappointed as well. The turning point for Moses' career was his meeting with Alfred Smith, the governor of New York these days. Contemporaries describe him as the complete opposite of Moses. Smith came from poor immigrant slums of the Lower East Side, born literally under the Brooklyn Bridge. He was forced to drop out the school after his father's death to feed his family and learned about life through street fights and alliances. Smith possessed a natural wit, empathy, and deep connection with ordinary people, something Moses very much lacked. Their tandem would change New York forever. Moses provided precision, knowledge of laws, and the ability to design systems, while Smith provided political reach, power, and the opportunity to turn theories into real infrastructure. In 1924, Smith appointed Moses as chairman of newly created Long Island State Park Commission. The position was not too large, but Moses was no longer held back by formal boundaries. It was an ambitious project to build parks that he would first demonstrate his aggressive, uncompromising management style. At that moment, he faced fierce resistance from the wealthiest estate owners of Long Island, who did not want to hear tourists or car horns near their properties. But they didn't know who they were dealing with yet. First, Moses secured the support of ordinary New Yorkers. In our story, the archetype of evil millionaire resurfaces, but this time in the service of Moses himself. He simply drove to the elite homes with a bunch of journalists and started giving fiery speeches about how they were preventing the working class from getting normal parks. Progressive newspaperman happily picked up this narrative. Second, he began construction before receiving approval. He understood that as soon as the bulldozer started working and the landscape changed, it would be almost politically impossible to stop the project. And third, Moses's most important and most insidious invention, and to be honest, it's something between infinite money code in GTA and God mode in Minecraft. Instead of waiting for money from the regular city or state budget, which requires votes, approvals, and oversight, he created special, semi-independent organizations called authorities. For example, bridge or transport agencies, which had the right to borrow money themselves. These organizations issued bonds. Essentially, they borrowed from investors with a promise to pay it back later with interest. And you must admit, a huge bridge in a metropolis sounds like a more reliable enterprise than, for example, a halal truck. At this moment, it was only about parks and roads, but investors were already bringing money with great pleasure. And then, when a bridge or a road was built, a toll was introduced, and this money went not into the city's general budget, but directly into the same organization. From these proceeds, it paid off debts and at the same time took out new ones against future income to build even more facilities. The result was a closed-loop system. Infrastructure itself generates money, new loans are taken with that money, and the cycle repeats. In essence, a state within a state was created. Moses' structures were almost not subject to ordinary political control. The money was locked to them. It couldn't easily be redirected to, for example, schools or hospitals, and Moses himself gained enormous power because he controlled both the construction and the flow of money at the same time. Right behind me is Robert Moses Building, which can be considered his supervillain headquarters. The income from Triborough Bridge was collected exactly here, which allow Moses to maintain power without elections. And as I said, the most interesting question in that whole story is a concentration of power in one pair of hands. From this moment on, Moses' methods cannot be described as anything other than autocratic, but it's important to soberly access the impact of his projects. We only had time to briefly tell you about his very first project. Primarily, it's a park, but much more important were the roads to it. They were called parkways. Their location changed the value of surrounding housing. Moses used this to bribe the elites, but more important, it became a key element of the automotive paradise that an entire continent later turned into. The hero of our story called these roads ribbon parks. They were designed as scenic routes exclusively for passenger cars, intended to provide pure pleasure from driving. From this follows also the most famous reasons for criticizing Moses. Because the bridges on these routes were too low for buses to pass, it automatically excluded the poor colored population from the new utopia. But this criticism is now increasingly being disputed, and in any case does not negate the fact that Americans liked Moses' projects of the future. And besides all his abilities for manipulation and behind-the-scene games, he was still an outstanding builder. On his account are literally thousands of different facilities in New York, from playgrounds and swimming pools to football stadiums. For example, the Verrazano Bridge is still the longest suspension bridge in the world, and Lincoln Center, right behind me, is the world's largest cultural complex. The appearance of modern New York, which became a model of metropolis, first for all of America and then for the whole world, was largely shaped by Moses. But as with any other achievements of authoritarian management methods, a question hangs over Moses' achievements. What had to be sacrificed for this? The main problem with Moses' style of construction, as with most innovators to this day, is that they see the fragile balance of a city or country structure woven from compromises and concessions as one big obstacle to their magnificent design. For example, behind me is one part of Triborough Bridge, one of the Moses' achievements and also one of the most important highways in the city. But do you know what's under it? Look! It's hard to say how many of these houses are already empty and why residents still remain here. Most of the real estate here is occupied by warehouses or car repair shops. Once, this area was inextricably linked with the rest of the Bronx, but for the construction of the highway, thousands of houses were demolished and tens of thousands of people were evicted. But if you walk just a couple blocks north, you'll see the real living Bronx, with local diners, street leisure, and everything else that makes a city alive. Over the last 50 years, some part of the Bronx have changed beyond recognition several times, but it is this section that is still preserved in a state of decay because of Robert Moses' project. The same thing happened in many other parts of New York. Places with poor colored population was especially vulnerable to such interventions. Let me remind you that they also found themselves in this position not by themselves, but conservatives take a deep breath because of systemic discrimination. But as a result of the defenselessness of these communities, Moses' projects buried the following. The San Juan Hill neighborhood, with its African-American and Puerto Rican population, was demolished almost completely for the construction of Lincoln Center. This very neighborhood was one of the main centers of black culture, jazz and bebop. The Sunset Park neighborhood in Brooklyn was once Scandinavian, then Latin American, and now Chinese population is cut through by an overpass. Of course, Harlem and the Bronx, with black and Latin American populations, also suffered from the construction of the Triborough. In all three cases, the neighborhoods never returned to their former liveliness. And speaking bluntly, even 50 years later, these are some of the most depressed places in New York. But there was a moment when Moses' victory march stopped, and it was all because of a woman named Jane Jacobs. Jane Jane Jacobs was a journalist, author, and activist who later became the patroness of good urbanism. Their first clash with Moses occurred when he was going to lay a highway right through Washington Square Park. From today's perspective, the idea sounds like pure madness. And being both a resident of the Greenwich Village neighborhood and a mother, she saw the park not as an empty space, but as the living room of the neighborhood. She organized a coalition of mothers with strollers, artists, and professors to protect the park. At the public hearings, Moses, accustomed to absolute obedience, flew into a rage and dismissively threw out, "Nobody is against this project except a bunch of housewives." This insult only united protesters and gave their movement some moral weight. In 1959, Mayor Robert Wagner, feeling unprecedented public pressure, sided with the residents and finally closed the park to traffic. This became Moses's first major defeat by ordinary citizens. The confrontation between Jacobs and Moses can be called one of the most important, if not the most important, in the history of urbanism. One of the main tools of the struggle was the book The Death and Life of Great American Cities. I have read it, but I can only recommend it to those who are specifically passionate about urbanism. To be honest, I'm already tired of the caricature types in this story, both in the retellings of other authors and in Jacobs' own book. She appears as just a textbook rival of Moses. She's sincerely in love with natural randomness and sloppiness of the city, protecting the natural, situationally formed distribution of social roles and public rituals, and many of her ideas have now become part of the base of modern urbanism. The main battlefield for Moses and Jacobs became the Lomax Project, which came from Lower Manhattan Expressway. Following the example of what Moses has already managed to do in all other boroughs of New York, he set to work on the wealthiest and the most historically valuable of them, Manhattan. But we must give him a credit. The concept was quite rational. It connected several of the most important bridges and tunnels with a 10-lane highway across the entire island. If this had been successfully implemented, it would now be a vital transport artery, not only for the city of New York, but for two states at once. But in the way of Moses's creativity, once again stood living people. According to one frequently cited estimate, 416 buildings were slated for demolition, which houses 2,200 families, 365 shops, and 480 other commercial establishments. Other museums and historical sources give a rougher but also indicative estimate. About 2,000 people were to be relocated and about 800 businesses affected for the sake of the route. The scale itself is even more important than the discrepancy in the numbers. It was not about a wasteland, but about Soho, Little Italy, and the part of Lower East Side, about neighborhoods with a working economy, craft and production premises, housing, street life, and one of the world's largest concentration of cast iron architecture. Jacobs created an entire commission to oppose the highway and was remarkably productive during that period. She organized rallies, wrote text and public remarks, worked with the press, filled public hearings with opponents of the projects, achieved delays through procedural mechanisms, and most importantly, broke the habitual style of decision-making, where officials first efficiently approve everything and then call residents only formally to speak out. In this sense, Jacobs attacked not only the highway itself, but also the way in which Moses had conducted his project for decades. Behind closed doors, through a network of department and quasi-independent bodies where public consent was secondary. There were several vivid historical episodes in this confrontation, and I recommend my most inquisitive viewers to read about this independently. But the main result of Jacob's activity was the negative reputation of the project in the eyes of New Yorkers. In 1965, the new mayor John Lindsay made the refusal to build Lomax part of his election campaign, and after winning, began to systematically strip Moses of power. A few years after that, the Triborough Bridge Authority, Moses's main financial bastion, was absorbed by a new structure, the MTA, and the master builder was left without levers of control for the first time in 44 years. When Moses was already an elderly man, his biography titled The Power Broker was released. And it's a very influential book that shows Moses from a not so favorable side. Moses appeared as an arrogant autocrat who, for the sake of his projects, ran a steamroller over the needs of ordinary people and destroyed entire neighborhoods. The book solidified Moses' reputation as a man whose action led to the social decline and the fall of New York. Barack Obama noted the book helped him at age of 22 to understand the unwritten rules of American politics. Bill Clinton recommended it for his entire staff in his very first week at the White House. The book is studied in more than 200 journalism departments in the US as the gold standard of investigative biography, and it served as one of the sources of inspiration for the series House of Cards. And approaching the finale, the conclusion that Moses was, after all, a villain just begs to be made. Among progressive New Yorkers, this is a consensus, while Jacob is canonized among the ranks of urbanist saints. This would even seems to have an embodiment in real life. You have seen yourselves what the neighborhoods that Moses passed through looks like, whereas neighborhoods that Jacob managed to save are now some of the most popular, beautiful and lively in New York. But it's not all that simple. Jacob's example inspired many other activists, not all of whom are fighting caricature evil. In modern America, there is a trend called NIMBY, which translates to "not in my backyard." This is called one of the most important reasons for the current crisis in housing and in infrastructure and much else in modern America. In particular, and first and foremost, New York especially needs new shelters for the homeless, new centers for working with mental health problems, new subway lines, new roads, and of course new homes. But in 100% of cases, there is a people inspired by Jacobs who will try to oppose this. Certainly, this desire to protect their community and a way of life can be understood, but among modern Democrats, the most relevant new idea, here's who really needs a new ideas, is called abundance. Its essence is this: in liberal cities, it has become too difficult to build anything, housing, roads, energy, because of the enormous number of rules, approvals, and the groups to block the projects. Therefore, instead of endlessly arguing and dividing limited resources, it is necessary to simplify the system and start building a lot and quickly, because only in this way can prices really be reduced, housing and services made more accessible, and accumulated problems solved. And to really implement this idea, most progressive Democrats will not hear another choice than to became Robert Moses, at least for a tiny bit. More than 50 years later, the only monument to one of the greatest builders of capital of the world is located in an hour's drive from the city of New York. There is irony here on two levels. First, the town in which it's located is called Babylon, and second, the bronze Moses is doomed to forever stare at a gas station that is located right across from his monument. I'm waiting for your thoughts about the strong hand and whom it will choke in the comments. And if you want to support my channel, just subscribe, because it was a fucking torture to speak English because I'm originally a Russian YouTuber. Anyway, if you are with me still in that moment, I really appreciate it. I love you. Thank you.